Hey everyone, Amtrak Guy 365 here, and today on this episode of Engines of New York Central, I'll be talking about the railroad's Mohawk locomotive. During the 1910s in the United States, steam locomotive size, power, and speed was beginning to increase at a rapid rate. The New York Central was just one such railroad taking part in this. Freight drags were often behind aging and slow two-way O's and were holding up comparatively faster passenger trains. Needing a locomotive to better handle freight and passenger trains on the famed water level route, the Central initially developed 462 Pacific type engines for mixed traffic. However, more speed was needed. This led to the 482 Mohawk type locomotive. While most other railroads would come to call their 482s mountains, the Central named their 482s after the Mohawk River, which ran next to the railroad. The first Mohawks were delivered from the American Locomotive Company in July 1916. The first one being number 2500, classified as an L1. Variations of the L1 came in the form of the L1A, B, C, and D, each one with modifications or slightly different appearances. There were 185 L1s produced, number 2500 to 2684. They had 69-inch drivers producing 51,400 pounds of tractive force. These engines were placed into freight service with the goal of keeping speed on flat track. This didn't exactly go to plan though, as the L1s were unstable at high speeds due to the design of their reciprocating gear. As a result, the engines were limited to 60 miles per hour. Later in 1922, the American Locomotive Company, or ALCO, rebuilt L1s number 2518 and 2605 into three-cylinder experimental types. Number 2568 would be rebuilt into this type in 1924. Additional maintenance costs made these designs relatively unpopular, and no others were built. It wasn't until 1925 that the iconic New York Central Mohawk design would come to form. The L2 would be built by ALCO and was a much more modern design. They had larger boilers and tenders, and later versions looked distinctly like the Central's Hudson locomotives. As for technical specifications, the New York Central L2s were still 482s, 4 wheels up front, 8 driving wheels, and 2 trailing wheels. They were capable of speeds of 70 to 80 miles per hour, with 69-inch drivers producing 60,618 pounds of tractive effort. With engine and tender, they weighed in at 646,200 pounds. Both engine and tender, they came in at a length of 109 feet, width of 11 feet, and a height of 14 feet. The locomotives came equipped with 5 and 6 chime whistles. Here's a sample. 300 L2s and their subclasses were built between 1925 and 1930, being numbered 2700 to 2999, and put to service on freight trains. But like the L1s, they suffered from instability at higher speeds and were limited to 60 miles per hour. On another note, in 1936, L2C number 2873 would be streamlined for the Rexall Drugstore Company. It was placed on a 12-car promotional train for the company, touring most of the continental United States and Canada. Some years later in 1939, L2Ds number 2995 and 2998 were converted for high-speed service with Timken roller bearings, increased boiler pressure, among some other modifications. In conjunction with the subclass's lightweight drive rods, the two engines hauled passenger trains up to 87 miles per hour, making them suitable for mixed traffic service.
You're a special mixed traffic engine, said Sir Topham Hatt. You can pull coaches or freight cars quite easily.
This was perfect timing for the railroad, as their current motive power, even with 275 passenger Hudson locomotives, weren't meeting peak traffic demands. A fleet of mixed traffic Mohawks would complement the Hudsons on passenger and mail trains, on top of being suitable for express freight runs. This resulted in the L3 Mohawks. 65 engines number 3000 to 3064 were built by ALCO from 1940 to 1942. These would be the first truly dual-service Mohawk locomotives to power both freight and passenger trains, being heavier, more powerful, and much faster. The L3s carried over the upgrades from the L2D subclass, like 80 miles per hour operating speeds, roller bearings, trailing truck boosters to help acceleration, and large capacity tenders. They could easily speed out of a yard with a fast freight, get serviced, then run a great Steel Fleet Express passenger train in the same day. The L3s would be the penultimate Mohawks, but there would be one more class, the L4. Starting in 1942, 50 of these engines would be built numbered 3100 to 3149. They had 72-inch drivers, 48-foot-long tenders, they had roller bearings on all axles, weighed 780,800 pounds, and produced 59,854 pounds of tractive effort. The L4s would serve as the send-off for the Mohawk fleet, the New York Central now amassing a fleet of 600 Mohawk engines. Much like the L3s, the L4s were
Mixed traffic
and could pull wartime freight trains and easily take on an express passenger train in the same day. In cooperation with the Central's then new Niagara locomotives in 1945 and 46, the Mohawks pulled the Pacemaker Express freight and passenger train. The L4s ran an average of 27,500 miles per year, just over the circumference of the Earth at 24,901 miles. However, the L4s wouldn't last all that long in service. Dieselization was already occurring as early as the 1940s, and L4s were being retired as early as 1954. By May of 1957, the Central had completely dieselized their roster. Steam locomotives, including the Mohawks, would be retired to storage yards, and many were eventually scrapped. All Mohawks would be scrapped, except two, and two tenders. L2D number 2933 was donated by the Central to the National Museum of Transportation of St. Louis, Missouri in 1963. It was cosmetically restored in May 2017. L3A number 3001 was sold to the Texas and Pacific in 1957. It took the place of T&P number 638, a 210-4 at the Texas State Fairgrounds, which had been heavily vandalized and scrapped in 1955. 3001 masqueraded as T&P number 909 during its time on display at the fairgrounds, then the Museum of the American Railroad, formerly known as the Age of Steam Railroad Museum at Frisco, Texas. In the early 1980s, 3001 was traded for a Pennsylvania Railroad GG1, and in 1987 was transferred back to New York Central Territory at Elkhart, Indiana, bound for the National New York Central Railroad Museum. 3001 would also be cosmetically restored. Also at the museum is L3B number 3042's tender, once used on the American Freedom Train and Chessie Steam Special. L1D number 2662's tender is used behind Lake Superior in Ishpeming number 34, restored as Western Maryland number 734 at the Western Maryland Scenic Railroad. The locomotive now sits outside unprotected from the elements. The New York Central's Mohawks had their humble origins in the 1910s, but soon enough became a reliable and fast mixed-traffic engine. Plus, unlike most other New York Central steam engines, a decent few pieces of Mohawk history still remain. Regardless, the Mohawks sure enough made their impact on what was the New York Central system, the road to the future. Thanks for watching this episode of Engines of New York Central. Sorry that it took so long, but I hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned for next time where I'll discuss the Niagara locomotive. Thank you again for watching.